Before we begin, do you have a theory about this case or a story of your own? Leave a message on our socials. Our handles are all just Nightwatch Files without the space, or head over to nightwatchfiles.com to find them all in one place. Your insights might be featured in a future episode. I'm Harper Finley, and this is Nightwatch Files. Quick note, if you enjoy the show and want to support it continuing, we have a Patreon that goes for just $3 a month. You'll get ad-free access to every episode, and you can now listen to them on Spotify and Apple Podcasts as a Patreon supporter. Whether you want to help keep the show going or just prefer listening without ads, you can find the links in the episode description. Now, let's get into today's case. Late on the night of January 20th, 1931, in a quiet Liverpool suburb, a man arrived home to find he couldn't open his front door. It was locked from the inside. His neighbors, leaving their house next door, watched as he hurried past them toward the back entrance. He tried the back door. It wouldn't budge. He returned to the front, tried again, still locked. The neighbors offered to help. Together, they went back to the rear of the house. This time, the door opened easily. The man entered alone, moving through the dark house, room by room, kitchen, middle bedroom, bathroom, front bedroom. Then he looked into the parlor. He struck a match. In the flickering light, he saw his wife lying on the floor, her skull shattered by 11 savage blows. He rushed back outside and cried to his neighbors, "Come and see, she has been killed." The police arrived within the hour. The scene was gruesome. Blood spattered across the walls, the body positioned near the fireplace, a Macintosh raincoat lying beneath her shoulder. But as officers searched the house, they noticed something. The husband seemed calm, perhaps too calm. When questioned, he offered an explanation. He'd been across town all evening, he said, searching for an address that didn't exist. He'd been lured there by a mysterious phone call. A call that had come the night before while he was at his chess club. A man had rung asking for him specifically, leaving a message. The caller gave a name and an address where he supposedly wanted to discuss insurance business. But when the husband arrived at the location, there was no such address. He'd spent nearly an hour asking strangers for directions, trying to find a place that simply wasn't there. The police began to investigate. They traced the mysterious call, they examined the crime scene, they interviewed neighbors and colleagues, and the more they learned, the more suspicious they became. The investigation that followed would become one of the most controversial murder cases in British legal history. A case that would divide a nation, destroy reputations, and remain unsolved for 50 years, until a dying man in a hospital bed finally broke his silence. William Herbert Wallace was born on August 29, 1878, at 44 Newton Street in Milham, a town on the western outskirts of the Lake District, north of Barrow-in-Furness. His parents, Benjamin and Marjorie Wallace, were working class. Benjamin was a printer who struggled to find success, supplementing his income as a part-time prudential agent while pursuing his passion for geology as an amateur. William had two siblings, a brother, Joseph Edwin, 2 years younger, and a sister, Jessie, several years his junior. The two brothers shared a striking facial resemblance and were so devoted to each other that locals referred to them as the Wallace twins. From a young age, Wallace showed an intellectual curiosity that set him apart. By the age of 9, he had developed a keen interest in botany, natural history, and related subjects. He joined the public library, where he formed a close friendship with the chief librarian, Ernest Beck. In 1888, when Wallace was 10, the family relocated to Blackpool. That same year, he contracted typhoid fever, the only serious illness he would experience during his childhood. The family's stay in Blackpool was brief. By 1890, they had returned to the Furness district, settling at 27 Victoria Street in Dalton near Barrow. Wallace's formal education ended when he was 14, around 1892. He took a position as a linen draper's assistant at Messrs. Tennants of Cavendish Street in Barrow. His wages were modest, 3 shillings a week in his first year, with incremental increases of 2 shillings per week over the next 5 years. After approximately 6 years with the company, in 1898, Wallace resigned from Messrs. Tennants. By this time, he was earning about 13 shillings a week. He moved to Manchester, where he secured a similar role with a wholesale firm, this time with better pay. Meanwhile, his brother Joseph had married a woman named Amy Blackwell and had taken a position as a printer for the Chinese government in Shanghai. Seeking his own opportunity abroad, Wallace applied for a salesman position at the Calcutta branch of Whiteway Laidlaw and Company. In 1902, at the age of 23, he set sail for India. His time abroad would have a lasting physical effect on him, giving him a sallow complexion that he would carry for the rest of his life. Wallace's years in India and China were marked by recurring health problems. He had suffered from a kidney complaint since his early 20s. In 1905, while still in Calcutta, he was admitted to the German hospital for an operation to treat pyelitis, an inflammation of the kidney pelvis. The condition persisted, and on April 7, 1907, he was admitted to Guy's Hospital in London, where surgeons removed his left kidney. The recovery was lengthy. By October 1908, Wallace had finally recuperated enough to return to work at the Manchester wholesale firm. By this time, his parents and sister Jessie had relocated to Harrogate. In the summer of 1909, Wallace met Julia Dennis in Harrogate. Julia was 33 years old, the daughter of a veterinary surgeon. Their courtship would last 2 years. In December 1913, Wallace's mother, Marjorie, died. Wallace and Julia married on March 24, 1914, at St. Mary's Parish Church in Harrogate. After a brief honeymoon, Wallace moved his few possessions from his family's residence at 9 Belmont Road to join Julia at 11 St. Mary's Avenue. Within weeks, Wallace's father, Benjamin, and his sister Jessie also moved into the same house. Around the outbreak of World War I, Wallace had been working as a liberal agent, but he resigned, stating the job ceased to be worth keeping up. In the first week of March 1915, William and Julia relocated to Liverpool, where he took a position as an agent for the Prudential Assurance Company. They moved into 26 Pennsylvania Road in Clubmore. On March 22, 1915, just weeks after Wallace had started his new job in Liverpool, his father Benjamin died of a cerebral hemorrhage at the age of 79. He died in the workhouse infirmary at Knaresborough, about a mile outside Harrogate. It's believed that Wallace's sister Jessie, who worked there as a nurse, had arranged for their father to be admitted to the infirmary. After approximately 4 months in Liverpool, around July 1915, the Wallaces moved from Pennsylvania Road to 29 Wolverton Street in Anfield. They rented the small red brick house for 14 shillings and 3 pence a week. Wallace became involved in union activities. Having joined the Prudential Staff Union almost immediately upon joining the company, he served as chairman of the Liverpool branch of the union. In 1919, a police strike in Liverpool resulted in the dismissal of 951 officers, creating a severe shortage of experienced personnel. During the 1920s, Liverpool gained a reputation as the country's main center of Sinn Féin activity. In 1923, Wallace fell seriously ill with pneumonia and was nursed through it by a woman named Mrs. Wilson. Wallace kept meticulous records of his daily life in a large page-a-day diary. The 1928 diary provides a window into his marriage to Julia. On January 7th of that year, he noted that he had fallen out with his wife because she was buying too many newspapers. This was the only recorded quarrel in diaries spanning several years, suggesting their relationship was generally harmonious. On December 5th, 1928, Wallace experienced an anxious evening when Julia was very late returning home from Southport. A railway accident had delayed her journey. Wallace grew increasingly worried and went to the police station at 1 a.m. to check for news. Julia eventually arrived home after taking a bus, having waited at Southport station until after 10 o'clock because the line was blocked by a laundry van crash. In his diary, Wallace recorded his relief that she was safe, noting he had been getting apprehensive, fearing that she might have been run over by a motor car or something. The following year, 1929, brought small moments that revealed the couple's different temperaments. On March 20th, they listened to a radio broadcast of Ibsen's The Master Builder. Wallace considered the play a fine thing, but Julia was unimpressed. In his diary, Wallace speculated that she did not grasp the inner significance and real meaning of the play. That same year, Amy Wallace, the wife of William's brother Joseph, returned to England from Malaya. At the time, Malaya was a British-controlled territory made up of the Straits Settlements, the Federated Malay States, and the Unfederated Malay States. Most of this area is now part of peninsular Malaysia, the western portion of the modern nation. Joseph was employed there as a printer for the Malayan government. Amy left him behind, saying she could no longer endure the waste, the harsh smells, the local customs she viewed with contempt, or the oppressive heat. Her account reflects the prejudices and attitudes common in her social circle and period, rather than an objective picture of the place or its people. Also in 1929, Wallace received violin lessons from his prudential superintendent, Joseph Crewe. The year 1930 saw significant developments in Wallace's health and in Liverpool's police force. At the beginning of the year, Herbert Moore was promoted to the rank of superintendent in the Liverpool City Police Force. His promotion had been assisted by the police strike of 1919, which removed many of his competitors, and by his work combating Sinn Féin activity, which were actions and unrest related to the Irish nationalist movement in Liverpool during the 1920s. By the end of 1930, Moore was placed in charge of the Criminal Investigation Department. On the June 9, 1930, Wallace was admitted to the Royal Hospital in Liverpool, complaining of pain in his right loin. Doctors confirmed the absence of his left kidney, which had been removed in 1907, and a blood test indicated that his remaining right kidney was not functioning satisfactorily. Treatment was limited to medicinal and palliative care, as surgical procedures were ruled out. On December 5, 1930, exactly 2 years after the previous incident, Wallace again recorded in his diary an anxious evening spent waiting for Julia, who was late returning from Southport due to a railway accident. He noted that he went to the police station at 1 a.m. to check for news of her yet again. Despite Wallace's health concerns, those who knew the couple during this period saw no obvious problems in their marriage. James Caird, Wallace's chess-playing friend and neighbor, observed them to be a very happy couple. The new year began quietly. On Wednesday, January 7, 1931, Mrs. Sarah Draper, the charwoman employed by the Wallaces, came to 29 Wolverton Street to carry out her normal cleaning duties. It would be her last visit for 2 weeks, as she had lost her husband and would not return during that time. That same day, Wallace made an entry in his diary. "A night of keen frost," he wrote. "The heavy fog gives a wonderful appearance to all plants and trees." He noted that every twig and leaf was most beautifully bordered and outlined with a white rim of frost. He recorded persuading Julia to visit Stanley Park after dinner, where she was equally charmed. He concluded that a gradual thaw seemed to be settling in. The following Thursday, January 15th, Wallace was attacked by influenza. On Friday, he did not do any insurance collecting, instead working on his accounts at home. By Saturday, January 17th, he still felt unwell and spent the morning with his feet in a mustard bath, occasionally sipping whiskey and water, rather than doing his normal round of collections from about 10 in the morning until midday. By Monday, January 19th, Wallace had only just recovered from the influenza. Julia, however, was now suffering from a cold. That evening, Wallace planned to attend the chess club to play a tournament game he was in arrears on, needing to get it wiped off. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Shortly before 7 o'clock that evening, a man named Baruch arrived at the City Cafe, home of the Central Chess Club, and settled down to a game with a man named Beatty. At 7:15, operator Louisa Alfreds received a call from a public telephone box, designated Anfield 11627. Around 2 minutes later, operator Lillian Kelly received a call from the same box. The male caller said he had pressed button A but had not connected. The automatic device showed he had pressed button B and received his money back. At approximately 7:20, the call was referred to Supervisor Annie Robertson, who eventually succeeded in putting the caller through to Bank 3581, the number for the City Cafe. At 7:20, or shortly thereafter, the telephone rang at the cafe. Gladys Harley hurried across to answer it. Beatty took the receiver. The call lasted at least 4 minutes, ending around 7:24. The caller, who would later be referred to as Qualtrough, asked for W.H. Wallace. When told Wallace wasn't there yet, Qualtrough requested that Wallace call on him the following evening, Tuesday, at 7:30 at 25 Menlove Gardens East, Mossley Hill. He stated that he couldn't ring up later as he had his girl's 21st birthday on and wanted to do something for her in the way of his business. Before 7:45, Wallace arrived at the City Cafe. Tournament matches had to start by this time. He took off his hat and mackintosh. At about 7:50, Beatty delivered the message to Wallace, who was playing a match with McCartney. Wallace used a silver propelling pencil and a small Prudential giveaway diary to copy the details Beatty had written on an envelope. He wrote East in capital letters on its own line. The evening passed. At about 10:20, Wallace, Caird, and another man named Bethern left the City Cafe and boarded a West Derby Road tram. Wallace was chattering happily about his success at the chess club. Wallace and Caird got off at the stop by St. Margaret's Church in Anfield and walked home together. Late that night, Wallace returned to 29 Wolverton Street, unlocking the door with his key. Julia was waiting up for him in the kitchen. She was distressed. Her black cat had disappeared, and she worried if she would ever see her lucky black cat alive again. Tuesday, January 20th, 1931, began with rain. It accompanied the dawn and drizzled steadily throughout the morning. Wallace left home at 10:30 to cover his insurance round in the Clubmoor district. He was behind with his 560 calls, having stayed home sick the previous Saturday. He finished his collection calls shortly before 2:00 and returned home for dinner with Julia, who was well. After eating, he retired upstairs to his laboratory and workshop. Around 3:15, Wallace left the house again. The weather had improved, so he wore his light fawn-colored coat instead of the mackintosh and returned to Clubmoor to continue his rounds. His afternoon calls revealed a puzzling contradiction. Mrs. Louisa Harrison remembered him being cheerful. They laughed and joked together. But at roughly the same time, Police Constable James Rothwell saw Wallace cycling along Maiden Lane towards Anfield Police Station, dabbing his eyes with his sleeve. Rothwell would later note that Wallace looked haggard and drawn and very distressed, unusually distressed, suggesting he had been crying. Yet minutes later at Mrs. Jane Harbord's house on Worcester Drive, Wallace was pleasant and jolly again, joking with her and speaking about the welcome change in the weather. At 4:00, Amy Wallace, William's sister-in-law, knocked at 29 Wolverton Street to ask Julia if she felt well enough to go to the Empire Theater on Friday to see Mother Goose. She left about 10 minutes later. Around 4:30, Neil Norbury, the baker's boy, saw Mrs. Wallace with a scarf wrapped around her neck. She told him she had a slight touch of bronchitis. Wallace continued his rounds through the afternoon. Mrs. Blanche Richards' house, Miss Ann Miller's at 5:45, then Mrs. Margaret Martin's between 10:06 and 5:06, where he helped her complete a policy surrender claim form. He arrived back at Wolverton Street no earlier than 5 minutes past 6, having boarded a tram at Queen's Drive and Townsend Avenue, then walked up from Cabbage Hall. Between then and 6:45, he had tea with Julia, who was quite well. What happened in the next hour would become the most contested period of the entire case. At 6:25, Alan Close, the milk boy, claimed to have looked at the illuminated dial of the Holy Trinity church clock and noted the time. Between 6:30 and 6:35, David Jones delivered the Echo newspaper. thrusting it through the letterbox without noticing any lights or hearing any noise. Then, according to the defense's calculation based on Close's route from the church, between 6:37 and 6:38, Julia Wallace was seen alive at the doorstep by both Close and Allison Wildman. Close received an empty can from Mrs. Wallace, who advised him to hurry home due to his cough, mentioning she had one too. At 6:45, Wallace left home by the back door, leaving Julia quite well. Wallace's journey across town was precisely documented. He boarded a number 4 tram at 6 minutes past 7 at the junction of Smithdown Road and Lodge Lane, receiving a transfer ticket to Penny Lane. At 7:15, he boarded a number 5A tram at Penny Lane, asking to be put off at Menlove Gardens East. He arrived near Menlove Gardens West about 7:20 and began searching for the address. For the next 25 minutes, Wallace spoke to several people: Sidney Green, Katie Mather, Police Constable James Sargent, all asking for directions to 25 Menlove Gardens East. At 7:45, he consulted his watch while speaking to Constable Sargent. After 7:45, he went to Miss Lily Pinch's newsagent's shop on Allerton Road and consulted a street directory. He was told there was no such place as Menlove Gardens East. Wallace started his journey home around 8 o'clock. He arrived back at Wolverton Street approximately 40 minutes later. He tried the front door and found it secure. He went to the back door, which he also couldn't open easily. Nearly 8:45, John and Florence Johnston, the neighbors from next door, were leaving their house when Wallace hurried past them towards his own yard door, which was standing open. Wallace asked the Johnstons if they had heard anything unusual tonight. He explained that the front door was locked against him and he couldn't open the back kitchen door. Johnston told him to try the back door again. This time, the back kitchen door opened quite easily. Wallace moved through the house, checking each room: kitchen, middle bedroom, bathroom, front bedroom where he found the bed upset. Then he looked into the parlor. After striking a match and entering the room, he found Julia lying dead on the floor. He rushed out and cried to the Johnstons, "Come and see. She has been killed." Inside, Wallace pointed out signs of disturbance. A broken locker lay on the floor in the kitchen, along with a till. He noted that about 4 pounds had been taken from his cash box. He also pointed out his bloody Macintosh lying beneath Julia's right shoulder. John Johnston left to call the police and a doctor. Police Constable Williams arrived about 10 past 9. He examined the body and felt the flesh was slightly warm. Julia's black cat returned home. Police Sergeant Joe Breslin arrived about a quarter of an hour before 10, followed at 10 minutes to 10 by Professor John Edward Whitley McFall. McFall noted rigor mortis in the neck and upper part of the left arm. He concluded Julia had been dead for at least 4 hours, placing the time of death before 6 o'clock. Detective Superintendent Hubert Moore was traced to the Press Club in Lime Street and informed of the murder. He arrived at 29 Wolverton Street at 5 past 10. About half an hour later, Constable Williams made rough notes of Wallace's initial statement. At 11 o'clock, Professor McFall discovered a blood clot in the bathroom on the rim of the lavatory pan, measuring 3/16 of an inch in diameter and 1/8 of an inch in height. Dr. Hugh Pierce, the police medical officer, arrived at 10 minutes to midnight. He concluded Julia Wallace had died 6 hours before, at about 6 o'clock. But at 12:10 in the morning, he noted that the rigor mortis was about the same. Then, between 12:10 and 1 o'clock, the rigor mortis rapidly spread to the extremities of 3 limbs, a development that would later raise serious questions about McFall's timeline. At 1 o'clock in the morning of Wednesday, January 21st, the body was removed to the mortuary. Also at 1 o'clock, Wallace made a recorded statement at Anfield Police Station. His hands and clothing were examined. They showed no trace of blood. After 2 in the morning, Detective Sergeant Harry Bailey drove to police headquarters with collected items, including 1-pound notes, one of which was found to be smeared with human blood. The investigation continued through the day. Mrs. Sarah Draper called at 29 Wolverton Street to carry out her cleaning duties, but was turned away. At 10 o'clock, Wallace arrived at police headquarters to provide fuller details of his movements. At midday, Amy Wallace formally identified the body, while Professor McFall conducted the post-mortem examination. In the early afternoon, detectives traced the Qualtrough call to the public telephone box, Anfield 1627. At about 5 o'clock, McFall emerged from his laboratory with the results of chemical tests on the blood clot from the lavatory pan. He stated it contained typical human red cells and white corpuscles, but was not menstrual blood. That evening, the Anfield Exchange supervisor called Moore back, confirming that the Qualtrough call had been traced to Anfield 1627 at 7:20 on Monday evening, and that 3 operators remembered the call. Also that evening, Alan Close was questioned by police after voluntarily coming forward to revise his statement. He now said he saw Mrs. Wallace alive at 6:45. At 10 o'clock that night, Wallace was allowed to leave police headquarters. He was driven to Amy Wallace's flat at 83 Ullett Road, where he would stay. Late into the night and into the early morning, Moore and other detectives took statements, finishing around 5 o'clock. The search for a man with bloodstains on his body or clothing continued all night across Liverpool. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. On the late afternoon of Monday, February 2nd, the Liverpool City Police obtained a warrant for Wallace's arrest. At 7 o'clock that evening, Superintendents Hubert Moore and Thomas, along with Inspector Gold, arrived at 83 Ullett Road, the flat belonging to Wallace's sister-in-law, Amy Wallace, where Wallace had been staying since the night of the murder. Inspector Gold arrested William Herbert Wallace on the charge of willful murder of his wife, formally cautioning him. Upon being arrested, Wallace asserted his absolute innocence, stating, "What can I say in answer to a charge of which I am absolutely innocent?" Moore's colleague, James Wilde of the Prudential, discussed starting a collection among branch members and contacting the Prudential Staff Union headquarters regarding financial aid for Wallace's defense costs. The following day, Tuesday, February 3rd, at 10:30 in the morning, Wallace appeared before the stipendiary magistrate, Stuart Deacon, for his first appearance in court. The committal proceedings formally began on this day, though they would be postponed and resumed later. J.R. Bishop, the prosecuting solicitor, made his opening speech, which would later be noted to contain at least 18 misstatements of fact. Wallace was remanded in custody for the maximum period of 8 days. He was received at Walton Gaol and admitted to the hospital for special observation. Hector Munro, newly returned from his honeymoon, accepted the brief as Wallace's solicitor and began gathering details of the case. On Thursday, February 5th, the inquest on Julia Wallace, which had been opened on January 22nd, was scheduled to resume, having been adjourned until this date. The next day, Friday, February 6th, Hector Munro received an anonymous letter written on Liverpool Cotton Exchange notepaper, which falsely suggested that Julia Wallace had previously tried to have her husband declared insane. Following Wallace's arrest, Munro focused on the crucial time factor and began gathering defense evidence. He spent several evenings interviewing neighbors in and around Wolverton Street. He tracked down the children, Kenneth Caird, Elsie Wright, and Douglas Metcalf, who had spoken to Alan Close, the milk boy, the day after the murder. Munro secured evidence that Alan Close had stated he saw Mrs. Wallace alive at 6:45 on the night of the murder. Elsie Wright testified that she saw Alan Close walking towards Wolverton Street at about 7:20. Munro also discovered David Jones, the newspaper boy, who stated he delivered the Echo to 29 Wolverton Street at about 6:35. On Wednesday, February 18th, Hector Munro interviewed Allison Wildman, a newspaper boy, who provided a statement confirming that he saw the milk boy at 29 Wolverton Street at 22 or 23 minutes to 7. The following day, Thursday, February 19th, the committal proceedings officially began. They would last for 7 days. The hearing was held in Number 2 Court, presided over by lay magistrate R.J. Ward. During the proceedings, J.R. Bishop repeated misstatements from his initial speech. Sidney Schofield Allen, the barrister representing Wallace, obtained assistance from Dr. Robert Koop regarding cross-examination strategy concerning the time of death and the unusual shape of the blood clot found on the lavatory pan. Schofield Allen compelled Inspector Gold to produce Wallace's 4 personal diaries from 1928 to 1931, which had not been previously submitted as evidence. Gold noted the only quarrel recorded in the diaries was a falling out with Julia on January 7, 1928, over buying too many newspapers. Gold then read a December 1930 diary entry detailing Wallace's immense anxiety when Julia was late returning from Southport due to a railway accident. Wallace was so affected by the reading that he was overcome with emotion and wept freely. As the proceedings continued through late February, Dr. Robert Koop began a series of 118 experiments involving drops of blood and blood clots to test the prosecution's claims regarding the blood found on the lavatory pan. Koop concluded that the blood found could not have been a fresh blood spot. Professor James Henry Diebel also concluded that it was impossible to estimate the time of death accurately based on Professor McFall's observations. Wallace stood up and formally pleaded not guilty, asserting that he and his wife had lived happily for 18 years and that the suggestion he murdered her was monstrous. Wallace was committed for trial at the Liverpool Spring Assizes. The committal proceedings against Wallace concluded just before March 4th. On that day, Arthur Evans, the local secretary of the Prudential Staff Union, wrote a long and eloquent letter of appeal to the union headquarters in London. Simultaneously, Mr. Wilde, the Prudential chief clerk, wrote to the Prudential head office regarding financial aid. The defense team, led by Solicitor Hector Munro, also wrote to the joint national secretaries of the union, outlining the necessary costs. Munro advised that between £800 and £1,000 would be required to ensure the briefing of the best counsel and securing competent scientific evidence. This sum included the potential fees for a leader counsel, Roland Oliver, estimated at 200 guineas, an old unit of British currency worth 21 shillings or £1.05, on the brief and refresher fees of 50 guineas per day beyond the first. Wallace's brother, Joseph, had already contributed a large sum, helping the initial defense fund reach slightly less than £450. Within a fortnight of the committal, the defense fund was boosted to £600. This increase included a grant from the Prudential Assurance Company, which agreed to provide a sum not exceeding £150 towards the costs, citing Wallace's long and faithful service. A pivotal event occurred when the joint national secretaries of the union developed an extraordinary plan to decide the level of union assistance. On Thursday, March 26th, the union held a mock trial in camera at Holborn Hall, the union headquarters in Gray's Inn Road. The purpose was to protect Wallace from prejudicial leaks and prevent the prosecution from learning the full defense strategy. Union officials from across the country attended and acted as the jury. The proceedings began at 10:30 and lasted all day. Norman Alsop, who had helped Wallace join the Prudential, brought the case before the union jury. Hector Munro presented the defense, replying to the transcript of J.R. Bishop's opening speech from the committal proceedings. Following a discussion period lasting 2 or 3 hours, the union president, J.C. Kinneberg, called for a vote. The count revealed a unanimous verdict in Wallace's favor. The Executive Council immediately announced that they would guarantee the whole cost of the defense. This decision was noted as making trades union history, as unions did not typically cover defense costs unrelated to union activities. The day following the mock trial, the W.H. Wallace Defense Fund was set up, and contributions from union members began pouring in. A circular letter was sent to all members setting out the broad facts of the case and the Executive Council's decision. The announcement appeared on April Fool's Day. Contributions from the 7,000 members began flooding into the union treasurer's office. Over 4,000 members would eventually respond. In March, Edward Hammond, the recorder of Liverpool, was offered and accepted the leading prosecution brief in the Wallace case. The choice of Hammered caused considerable commotion in Liverpool. Hammered viewed this brief as an olive branch from the Liverpool Corporation, signaling an end to a long feud. He recognized that his handling of the case would be a crucial test, potentially determining his future legal prosperity and security. Before April 13th, Roland Oliver, KC, accepted the brief to lead for the defense. On Monday, April 13th, the Liverpool Spring Assizes began. Around April 20th, Wallace was driven from Walton Gaol to St. George's Hall. He was lodged in a cell to await the decision of the grand jury. Before being moved, a warder gave him his personal belongings: watch, ring, cigarette case, fountain pen, which he had to give up again upon returning to the jail each evening. On Tuesday, April 21st, the committal proceedings against Wallace were fully concluded, immediately preceding the trial. On the morning of Wednesday, April 22nd, Wallace, pale-faced and dressed in black, appeared in the dock. The clerk of assize intoned the formal words of the indictment. Edward Hammered rose to make the opening speech, so promptly that it seemed to overlap the clerk's instruction to the jury. Hammered's speech lasted 2 hours. He used an iron bar, similar to the missing parlor poker, and flourished it menacingly before letting it fall with a resounding crash, creating an electric effect on the jury. Hammered advanced a revised theory, suggesting that Wallace wore the Macintosh over his nude body while committing the crime to avoid bloodstains. He stressed the absence of motive for murder as a point against Wallace, suggesting the act was murder foul and unpardonable. After Hammered's speech, the courtroom was silent for a second before filling with excited conversation. Leslie Walsh, junior counsel for the Crown, conducted the examination of the first witnesses. Harry Cook, the police photographer, was questioned by Roland Oliver, who used Cook's testimony to highlight contradictions in the police photographs regarding the movement of objects in the parlor. 7 witnesses testified about the Qualtrough telephone call, including the GPO engineer, the 3 operators, and the City Cafe staff, Gladys Harley and Samuel Beattie. Beattie's description of Qualtrough's voice as strong and gruff and confident contrasted with the operator's description of it as just ordinary. That afternoon, Police Constable James Rothwell testified that he saw Wallace crying in the street at about 3:30 on Tuesday afternoon, looking haggard and drawn. Alan Close, the milk boy, testified. His examination in chief by Leslie Walsh was over in 2 minutes, but Roland Oliver's cross-examination was intense. Close admitted that the time he gave, 6:30, was based on retracing his steps and timing the route from the church clock. Oliver relentlessly questioned Close about whether he had initially told other children that he saw Mrs. Wallace alive at 6:45. Hammered tried to repair the damage by suggesting Thomas Phillips, the tram conductor, might have left later than his previous testimony. Witnesses confirmed Wallace's movements and inquiries in the Menlove Gardens area, strengthening the prosecution's alibi theory. Joseph Crew, Wallace's prudential superintendent, testified, confirming Wallace's reputation as a gentleman, but was unintentionally helpful to the defense by clarifying that Wallace's largest collections occurred in the monthly week. Lily Hall, the young typist, was the final witness of the day, testifying that she saw Wallace talking to another man in Richmond Park at 8:35 on the night of the murder. The long first day concluded. Jurors were housed in a nearby hotel and guarded, unable to talk to anyone or read a newspaper. On Thursday, April 23rd, the court was brighter due to improved weather. The Johnstons, John and Florence, testified about meeting Wallace in the entry and discovering the body. John Johnston said the police photographs of the parlor appeared inaccurate. Police Constable Williams testified. Hammered tried to suggest the front door was not bolted, but Williams admitted he did not hear a bolt being drawn. Williams maintained Wallace had said Julia walked a little way down the entry with me and bolted the backyard door, which Wallace later denied. Mrs. Sarah Draper testified about the missing piece of iron from the sitting room fireplace. James Sargentson, the locksmith, testified that the back door lock was stiff and required pressure to open. Professor McFall took the stand. He was aggressive and insisted that death occurred 4 hours or more before his arrival, placing it before 6 o'clock. McFall introduced the theory that the crime was one of frenzy. Oliver's cross-examination was devastating, forcing the professor to admit he made practically none of his notes regarding rigor mortis. McFall was forced to admit that if Julia was alive at 6:30, his opinion was wrong. He was also forced to admit the blood clot on the lavatory pan might have been carried there by the police. Dr. Hugh Pierce, the police medical officer, testified and nervously placed the time of death at 6 hours prior to his arrival, about 6 o'clock, with a 2-hour margin of error. Detective Superintendent Moore testified, constructing a theory with Hammerd, that the absence of blood on Wallace's boots indicated guilt, as he must have known where the bloodstains were in the dark parlor. On Friday, April 24th, Detective Sergeant Harry Bailey testified. Inspector Gold was questioned about shadowing Wallace. He repeatedly claimed he was unaware of the surveillance, although he admitted Wallace was followed about the end of the week for his own protection. William Roberts, the city analyst, was recalled by Hammerd. Roberts claimed to have conducted exhaustive experiments showing that fresh blood drops from a height formed a conical blob like the one on the lavatory pan, but Roberts had no notes of these experiments. The Crown rested its case. The clerk of assize read Wallace's statement from the committal proceedings. Roland Oliver gave his closing speech, lasting less than half an hour. He stressed the lack of motive, the absence of evidence connecting Wallace to the call, and the insufficient time for the crime. William Herbert Wallace took the witness box at 2:30. His examination in chief lasted about an hour. He described his return home and finding Julia's body, admitting he tried to be calm and as cool as possible. Hammerd's cross-examination attempted to confuse Wallace by switching topics rapidly. Wallace remained composed, politely correcting Hammerd's misstatements. Hammerd spent significant time arguing that a wrong address was essential for Wallace's alibi to create multiple witnesses. Wallace was cross-examined for almost 3 hours. That afternoon, defense witnesses took the stand. Professor James Henry Diebel testified that McFall's time of death estimate was unreliable and that the murder might have been committed after 7 o'clock. Dr. Robert Koop testified that the blood clot on the lavatory pan must have been at least an hour old when deposited and could not have been a fresh blood spot. Allison Wildman testified for the defense, confirming he saw Alan Close at 29 Wolverton Street at about 23 minutes to 7. Other defense witnesses included the children who heard Close's original time of 6:45 and Wallace's insurance clients, who rebutted Police Constable Rothwell's claim that Wallace looked distressed. Mrs. Martin was the final defense witness. Mr. Justice Wright adjourned the trial, stating the closing speeches would be made the next morning. On Saturday, April 25th, at 10 o'clock, Roland Oliver began his closing speech for the defense. He argued that the medical evidence was unreliable and that the boy's original time of 6:45, which precluded Wallace, was his unaided recollection. Hammerd gave his closing speech, lasting 70 minutes. He stressed the singular coincidences and inherent improbabilities of Wallace's story. He submitted that the time of death was easily established and that Wallace had ample time, nearly 20 minutes, to commit the crime. Wallace, arms folded, listened intently to the proceedings. At 20 minutes past 1, Mr. Justice Wright finished his summing up, which lasted 1 hour. The judge's summing up was entirely favorable to Wallace, indicating that the prosecution had failed to prove the case beyond reasonable doubt. At 2:40, 1 hour and 20 minutes after the summing up concluded, the jury returned to the courtroom. The foreman of the jury pronounced the verdict, guilty. Wallace, asked if he had anything to say, replied firmly, "I am not guilty. I cannot say anything else." Mr. Justice Wright put on the black cap and passed the sentence of death. Canon Dwelly, the sheriff's chaplain, quietly added, "Amen." The execution was provisionally fixed for Tuesday, May 12th. On Sunday, April 26th, arrangements for the appeal began. Oliver, Munro, and Schofield Allen worked to formulate the grounds of appeal. Dozens of Merseysiders wrote letters to local editors expressing shock and disbelief at the verdict. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. On May 1st, Hector Munro, Wallace's solicitor, received a reply from the Prudential Staff Union Executive Council regarding funding for the appeal. The council expressed that they were all staggered by the verdict and felt bound to concur in exploring every possibility of saving Mr. Wallace from such a cruel fate. That same day, Munro wrote a confidential letter to E.T. Palmer, MP, stating that he was grieved by the shocking verdict. Munro expressed his opinion that the jury had no material whatever upon which they could convict, and that the judge's summing up was extremely favorable to the defense, having practically told the jury that there was no evidence upon which they could act. He noted that the appeal judges were likely to take the view that the jury were the judges of fact under English law. On Saturday, May 2nd, a 32-year-old man who had confessed to the murder 2 days earlier was medically examined, certified to be suffering from delusions, and removed to Rainhill Mental Hospital. The provisional execution date of Tuesday, May 12th, which had been fixed on April 26th, passed without it taking place, pending an appeal hearing. On Friday, May 15th, another 32-year-old man presented himself at Prescott Street, Bridewell, wishing to give himself up for the murder. Superintendent Moore, however, wrote to Munro the next day, noting that inquiries had shown the man to be peculiar in his manner for some time, making it obvious that he could not have committed the murder. On Saturday, May 16th, Superintendent Moore and the other CID officers involved in the case traveled to London to consult with prosecuting counsel Edward Hammond over the weekend. Later the same day, Wallace was transferred from Walton Gaol to London. He was handcuffed and dressed in his own clothes. He was taken by taxicab to Lime Street Station. Before leaving the condemned cell, he shook hands with the 2 Death Watch warders who wished him luck, with one saying, "I hope we don't meet again." During the train journey to Euston, Wallace was very greatly impressed by the green and wonderful beauty of the country, which served to cheer me and take my mind off the grim horrors. At Euston, he was driven in a Black Maria to Pentonville Prison, where he went through the routine of standing on a canvas sheet, emptying his pockets, and stripping off his clothes. A warder thoroughly searched him, combing his hair, separating his toes, looking under his armpits, and shining a flashlight inside his mouth. Wallace was ordered to dress in the blue uniform of an appellant and was taken to the Pentonville condemned cell. On Sunday, May 17th, all parties involved in the appeal were either in London or on the way. In Liverpool, special prayers were offered at the morning, afternoon, and evening services at Liverpool Cathedral by the Vice Dean, Canon Dwelly, who was the sheriff's chaplain at the trial. The prayer was for the judges of appeal, learned counsels, and the people of the County Palatine, asking that the judges may be guided in true judgment. On Monday, May 18th, the Wallace appeal began at the Royal Courts of Justice at 11 o'clock. The judges of appeal were Lord Hewart, Lord Chief Justice, Mr. Justice Branson, and Mr. Justice Hawke. Roland Oliver, K.C., presented the points in Wallace's favor. Wallace sat absolutely still, with his hands cupped around his ears, listening to the speeches. The hearing lasted the entire day. On Tuesday, May 19th, the appeal hearing continued into the morning. Wallace began to fidget with nervousness, and his gaze wandered restlessly. After 4:15 in the afternoon, the cry of silence was made, and the judges returned to the court, which was crowded to suffocation. Wallace was ushered in, looking tired and worn. He waited 14 minutes to hear the decision. Lord Hewart delivered the judgment, noting that the case was one of difficulty and doubt, and that the learned judge's summing up had been fair. Hewart announced the Court of Criminal Appeal's conclusion that the case against the appellant was not proved with that certainty which is necessary in order to justify a verdict of guilty. The conviction was quashed. Wallace was immediately ushered out of the dock. On the street, the news caused an excited crowd to gather around a taxi. Wallace later wrote that the 2 days before the appeal were the longest days of my life and a nightmare. On the same night, Hector Munro and Sidney Schofield Allen traveled back to Liverpool on the same train as Superintendent Moore and other CID officers. Moore, who was drinking, was distraught and incoherent, mumbling, "I still say he did it," and making continual reference to Wallace's calm behavior on the night of the murder as a sign of guilt. On Wednesday, May 20th, Wallace spent his first full day of freedom in London. He visited the Prudential head office and the Union headquarters. He spent the afternoon at Kew Gardens. On Thursday, May 21st, the inquest on Julia Wallace was resumed and formally closed. The Registrar of the Court of Criminal Appeal issued the notification. A police spokesman announced that the investigations would remain open and the case would not be closed until a conviction was secured. Wallace arrived in Liverpool in the afternoon. He immediately went to the Prudential building, where he spent an hour with Hector Munro, followed by a party given by his insurance colleagues. A large crowd formed in Dale Street upon hearing he was back, and police had to be sent to control the crowd as Wallace was driven away. Munro told reporters that Wallace had left for a quiet spot in Wales to find refuge. On Saturday, May 23rd, the first day of the Whitsun Bank holiday weekend, Wallace and his brother Joseph traveled north to the Furness Peninsula. They asked Mrs. Eleanor Douglas, the owner of a guest house in Broughton-in-Furness, if they could stay for a couple of weeks. Wallace introduced himself, saying he was the one from the news, and asked, "Will you still have us?" During May, two Labour MPs, J.S. Clark and J.H. Hayes, suggested in the House of Commons that Wallace should be given compensation for the suffering he has endured. The Home Secretary, J.R. Clines, stated he could make no statement. The matter was raised again a few days later, and the Home Secretary stated that Wallace's case did not differ in principle from any other defendant who had been acquitted or whose conviction was quashed. Sir William Jowett replied that since all witnesses called at the trial had given evidence at the police court, it was unnecessary to consider the suggestion that the trial was improperly handled. Wallace's journey from the condemnation of the gallows back to freedom was swift, but as transparent as glass. Despite his acquittal, he carried the social stigma of guilt, which led to a hostile public reaction upon his return to Liverpool. Wallace's stay at Mrs. Eleanor Douglas's guest house in Broughton-in-Furness continued into early June. He and his brother Joseph had arrived on May 23rd, planning to stay for about 2 weeks. During this retreat, they spent time walking, fishing in the River Duddon, and Wallace engaged in sketching. Amy Wallace, his sister-in-law, visited them there. While Wallace was away, Liverpool scandalmongers revived old rumors, suggesting he was a sex maniac, a vampire, a sadist, or a mad scientist, and warned men to protect their womenfolk should he return. Because of the rumors, Wallace's solicitor, Hector Munro, wrote to him, suggesting he accept the Prudential's offer of a transfer to another part of the country. Wallace replied, thanking Munro, but refusing the suggestion. He stated he intended to return to Liverpool and to 29 Wolverton Street on June 9th. He argued that moving would be taken by tattletales as an indication of guilt, despite his acquittal by the Court of Appeal. Munro wrote back, insisting that Wallace must find another place to live due to a strong and growing feeling of hostility toward him in Anfield. On June 9th, Wallace returned to 29 Wolverton Street, Anfield, as planned. Wallace immediately attempted to resume his old job, collecting insurance money in the Clubmoor district. He quickly encountered intense, pervasive hostility. Children were dragged into houses when he walked by. Doors slammed shut. Women opened upstairs windows and shouted curses at him. The tough guys of the neighborhood stood in his path, brandished their fists, and threatened him. Many long-standing clients refused to answer the door when he knocked. On June 15th, Wallace documented his failure to resume his agency in his diary. "I think I must definitely abandon the idea of returning to a Liverpool agency, as the ill feeling against me is evidently stronger than I expected." Wallace's Prudential superintendent, Joseph Crewe, arranged for Wallace's transfer from the field staff to a clerical job at the Liverpool head office of the Prudential. On June 16th, Wallace recorded his deep frustration with his neighbors in his diary. Find all the neighbors up against me. They are the rottenest crowd I ever struck. Mean and paltry-brained. I feel it is a wicked insult to Julia. How she would have scorned the whole thing. The harassment continued. Wallace continued to receive poison pen letters. His house became the main target for knocking down Ginger, banging on the door and running away, carried out by both children and grown-up people. Adults would call through the letterbox with shouts and taunts of "What's happened to Julia?" or "She's all chopped up, chop, chop, chop," and calling him Killy Willy. Curiosity seekers came from all over Liverpool to press their faces against the parlor window for a glimpse of the murder scene, and even clambered over the back wall to test the strength of the kitchen door or cut a piece from it as a souvenir. On June 23rd, Wallace decided the situation was unsustainable, telling Hector Munro, "You were right, it's impossible to carry on like this." With Munro's assistance, Wallace found a new residence, the Summer House, a small bungalow in Meadowside Road, Bromborough, on the Cheshire side of the Mersey. When the Pantechnicon arrived at Wolverton Street to remove the furniture, a crowd gathered, treating the event as a public spectacle. They cheered the van as it left, viewing the departure as cheers of victory. Wallace was transferred to a clerical job at the Liverpool head office of the Prudential. He would commute across the Mersey from his new residence in Bromborough to Dale Street, Liverpool, where the Prudential building was located. Despite being acquitted, Wallace experienced profound social isolation at his workplace in Liverpool. He noted that the men with whom I have won and lost at play so often, with whom I have exchanged views on topics of the day over coffee and cigarettes, pass me with heads tilted away from me. Wallace regularly lunched at the city cafe. He attempted to maintain a philosophical outlook, noting, "I suppose this feeling against me will probably persist for some time, and I may never really live it down. Well, after all, so long as I know I am innocent, why should I worry?" In the months following his acquittal, Hector Munro was actively briefing Sidney Schofield Allen in several actions against printers and publishers who had prejudiced Wallace's reputation. A group of newspapers had already agreed to pay £200 for publishing small indiscretions. This money was used as the down payment on the house in Meadowside Road, Bromborough. On August 25th, Wallace wrote an entry in his diary that highlighted his profound social distress and depression. He recorded, "To go about feeling that one is shunned by nearly everyone is a terrible ordeal, and though I try to fight it down and ignore it, the whole business depresses me beyond words." He also expressed a hope for the future, writing, "Perhaps after a while I may get immersed in some new hobbies to take my mind off the terrible tragedy." Wallace concluded this entry by revealing his fear of being alone at night. "What I fear is the long nights." On September 8th, Wallace wrote about his persistent grief. "The last few days I have been depressed, thinking of my dear Julia. I'm afraid this will be a very lonely winter for me. I seem to miss her more and more, and cannot drive the thought of her cruel end out of my mind." 6 days later, on September 14th, Wallace recorded a direct confrontation with Richard Gordon Perry, a former Prudential agent whom Wallace suspected of being the murderer. Wallace wrote in his diary that Perry stopped me and said he wanted to talk to me for a few minutes, just as Wallace was going to dinner. Wallace noted that this situation was a desperately awkward position. Wallace ultimately decided not to hear what he had to say. He informed Perry that he would talk to him someday and give him something to think about. Wallace explicitly documented his suspicion, stating, "He must realize that I suspect him of the terrible crime." Wallace worried that he had let Perry see clearly what I thought, which may have unfortunately put him on his guard. He pondered hiring a private detective. "I wonder if it is any good putting a private detective onto his track in the hope of something coming to light. I am more than half persuaded to try it." Wallace never followed through on this plan. In September 1931, the Herald of Salvation, an illustrated magazine of pure gospel literature, published an article that compared the Court of Criminal Appeal, which acquitted Wallace, with Heaven's Court of Appeal. The article stated that for Wallace, described as a condemned sinner, it would be essential for him to acknowledge the guilt and iniquity that were his, to appeal to God's court. The publication suggested that Wallace should, like other condemned sinners, make open confession of his crime, arguing that this would provide an object lesson for all men who love darkness rather than light. Wallace, a confirmed agnostic, was intensely angered by this libel, not primarily because it prejudiced his reputation, but because he had been used as an advertisement for something he did not believe in. This religious libel later resulted in a successful out-of-court settlement for Wallace. On October 6th, Wallace wrote explicitly about his shattered nerves and constant fear. He stated, "I cannot disguise from myself that I am dreadfully nervous about entering the house after dark." He attributed this nervousness to the fact that his nerves are all so shattered after the ordeal. He noted that this, combined with the recurring fits of grief and anguish over my dear Julia's end, makes me horribly depressed and apprehensive. He also revealed his continuing obsession with the crime, writing, "Left to myself, I am forever trying to visualize what really did happen." Just before Christmas 1931, Wallace began suffering from a recurrence of the kidney trouble that had afflicted him for most of his adult life. His condition rapidly worsened, and the pain increased. As a direct consequence of his failing health, Wallace was forced to give up his clerical job at the Prudential. The intense physical suffering and emotional exhaustion led Wallace to adopt a fatalistic view of his life. He told his friend, Annie Mason, that he had no wish to remain alive, suggesting he was committing slow suicide by refusing treatment for his illness. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Even after moving away from Anfield, he was still attempting to cope with severe social isolation and harassment, as he was still receiving poison pen letters. On February 9, 1932, Wallace could endure the pain no longer. An ambulance was called. He wept as he said goodbye to Annie Mason, telling her, "You have been goodness itself to me." Miss Mason believed that he was aware he was leaving his home for the last time. The ambulance transported him to the nearby Clatterbridge Hospital. Upon arrival, he was given drugs to ease the pain. After approximately 1 week at the hospital, an emergency operation was performed, but it was unsuccessful. Following the failed operation, Wallace was in a severe state, spending much of the time either delirious or unconscious. On March 20, 1932, Wallace wrote a deeply emotional entry detailing his ongoing grief and loneliness. He recorded, "Today I have been very much depressed, full of grief and tears." He agonized over the loss of his wife, Julia, asking, "Why were you taken from me? Why should this have been so?" He noted that this question went unanswered and that he must fight this dread feeling of utter loneliness as best I can. The W.H. Wallace Defense Fund, managed by the Prudential Staff Union, was still active and collecting money. The union treasurer was acknowledging contributions to the fund in the March 1932 issue of the Union magazine. In May 1932, the magazine True Detective Mysteries published an article called "The Crime at 29 Wolverton Street." This article was considered by some to contain the worst libel of all against Wallace. Legal action would follow, though the writ against the printers and publishers would not be issued until February 1933. Wallace's personal life during this period was defined by his irreversible physical decline and social isolation. On the evening of February 25th, Wallace was conscious when his nephew, Edwin Wallace, visited him. They talked for approximately a quarter of an hour, with the nephew doing most of the talking. As the boy left, Wallace murmured, "Do good with your life." These were his last words. Wallace lapsed into a coma soon afterwards. On February 26, 1933, Wallace was pronounced dead at 3 o'clock in the morning. The death certificate, signed by Elizabeth Lansdowne, MRCS, listed the causes of death as uremia, pyelonephritis, and left kidney removed 30 years ago. Following the announcement of his death, Liverpool became a city of speculation. Rumors spread that Wallace had made a dying confession, either verbally to his nephew or in writing in his diary. There was also a rumor that he had made a deathbed will in the presence of the master of the infirmary. Wallace's solicitor, Hector Munro, immediately took a statement from Edwin Wallace and issued it to the press, stating that the rumors about a confession or a deathbed will were absolutely untrue. On February 27th, Wallace's body was taken to a private chapel for a preliminary service. On February 28th, crowds set an attendance record at Anfield Cemetery, flocking around Julia's grave in search of clues. That night, after the cemetery closed, 2 gravediggers returned and, working by flares, dug away most of the soil covering Julia's coffin. On March 1st, 1933, the full committal service and funeral for William Herbert Wallace took place. The funeral cortege entered Anfield Cemetery by the back gate in Cherry Lane. The gravediggers had finished the job early that morning. The funeral was attended by 10 mourners, all male, including Wallace's nephew Edwin Wallace, his solicitor Hector Munro, and some of his old Prudential colleagues. 4 small wreaths were present, and after the clergyman concluded the service, Wallace's coffin was lowered into the grave. Wallace and Julia Wallace now share a common grave in Anfield Cemetery, where the inscriptions note both their names. The legal action against the printers and publishers of the magazine True Detective Mysteries was terminated by Wallace's death. Approximately 2 years after William Herbert Wallace's death in February 1933, probate was granted on his property in 1935. The total value of Wallace's estate was recorded as £1,672, 14 shillings and 7 pence. His brother, Joseph Wallace, was named the sole legatee, aside from a bequest of £100 made to Annie Mason. The evidence against Richard Gordon Parry emerged gradually, much of it surfacing only after Wallace's trial had concluded. But when examined together, it forms a compelling picture of guilt. Parry was a former Prudential insurance agent who had worked under Joseph Crew until early 1930. During his employment, he frequently visited the Wallace home and developed an intimate knowledge of their domestic arrangements. He had been in the parlor and kitchen many times, and had even been upstairs in the middle bedroom on several occasions when Wallace was ill. Julia Wallace knew him well, and would have had no hesitation in letting him inside the house. More importantly, Parry knew where the money was kept. Wallace habitually kept his collection money in a cash box on top of the bookcase in the kitchen, and Parry had watched him put money into it countless times when he called to receive his own collections. Parry's employment with the Prudential had ended under questionable circumstances. He had collected client payments but failed to return the cash, a deficiency of about £30 that his parents had to cover. Wallace knew Parry was either careless with money or dishonest, and had found persistent discrepancies in his accounts. Parry had been given the choice of resigning or being sacked. At the time of the murder, Parry was more than usually hard up, heavily in debt and pleading with friends for financial aid. As a frequenter of the city cafe for amateur dramatic society meetings and lunches, Parry could have consulted the chess club notice board to learn when Wallace was due to play a match. This knowledge would have allowed him to time the Qualtro call perfectly, ensuring Wallace received the message on a night he was certain to be at the club. The Qualtro call itself bears Parry's signature. Being an actor, Parry would have had little difficulty assuming the role of R.M. Qualtro. A former colleague stated that Parry, known for making prank calls, could alter his voice like changing a shilling. The choice of the unusual name was deliberate. The call was made from a telephone box just 400 yards from Wallace's home, close enough to suggest local knowledge, but far enough to avoid immediate suspicion. If the name was intended as a password into the house, Parry would have ensured Julia remembered it. The caller's excuse for cutting the conversation short is particularly revealing. Qualtrough told the chess club captain he was busy preparing for his girl's 21st birthday party. In 1966, 35 years after the murder, when Perry was interviewed about the case, he offered a new alibi, claiming he had spent the evening of the murder arranging a birthday celebration. Perry's original alibi came from his fiancée, Lily Lloyd. The police accepted it without investigation. But in 1933, after Perry jilted her, Lloyd confessed to Hector Munro that the alibi was false. She had been working at a cinema that night. The most damning evidence emerged 50 years after the murder, in 1981, when John Parks came forward with his statement. Parks had worked as a cleaner at Atkinson's garage in 1931. He stated that late on the night of the murder, or early the next morning, Perry drove into the garage in an agitated state. Perry insisted that Parks wash the car with a high-powered hose, both the bodywork and the inside. This was unusual. When Parks questioned it, Perry became more insistent. As Parks worked, he noticed a blood-stained glove protruding from the glove compartment. Perry saw him looking and snatched the glove away, saying, "If the police found that, it would hang me." Parks also overheard Perry muttering that he had hidden an iron bar down a drain in Priory Road. This statement is significant because Mrs. Sarah Draper, the Wallace's charwoman, had reported a large piece of iron missing from the parlor fireplace, described as about a foot long and as thick as a candle. The murder weapon was never found. Parks later learned that Perry had borrowed a pair of thigh boots and an oilskin coat from friends around the time of the murder. This suggests Perry wore protective gear to commit the crime without staining his clothing, which would explain the absence of blood on Wallace's own clothes. Parks claimed he reported the blood-stained glove and the iron bar story to Superintendent Moore in 1931, immediately after the incident. Moore's response was dismissive. "I think you've made a mistake." Parks's account of the car washing episode was later corroborated by Mrs. Dolly Atkinson, who worked at the garage. When researchers tracked down Perry in 1966, they found him working as a GPO telephone operator in Camberwell. He was described as plausible, evasive, manipulative, and clever, with a false, trowel-laid-on charm. He had large hands and a military-style mustache. Perry refused to discuss the case, even for a significant sum of money, citing a promise to his father. But he revealed that he was still tracking everything that appeared in connection with the case. He knew about the deaths of Joseph Crewe, Alan Close, and Wallace's nephew Edwin, the latter having died in North Borneo in circumstances not widely reported in British newspapers. Perry's criminal record painted a disturbing picture. Before the murder, he had charges involving theft and embezzlement. In September 1934, he was sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment with hard labor for stealing a car. In 1936, he was charged with indecent assault. The prosecution alleged he had offered to drive a girl home from a temperance bar in Prescott, then drove her to Rainhill and threatened to murder her before committing the assault. Professor Diebel, who examined the victim, later referred to Perry as a sexual pervert. Perry may have believed his connections would protect him. His father was a senior employee of the Liverpool Corporation, who later became assistant city treasurer. His father's secretary was Imelda Moore, the daughter of Detective Superintendent Herbert Moore, the head of the Liverpool CID, who led the investigation into Julia Wallace's murder. Perry told the 1966 interviewers he knew top people in Liverpool. Richard Gordon Perry died of a heart attack on April 14, 1980, leaving a will of £18,000. He had been doing part-time work as a switchboard operator in local hospitals. He was never charged with Julia Wallace's murder. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. William Herbert Wallace didn't kill his wife. The Court of Criminal Appeal understood this in 1931 when they quashed his conviction, stating the case against him had not been proved with the certainty necessary to justify a verdict of guilty. No blood on his hands or clothing, no credible motive, medical evidence that contradicted the prosecution's timeline. The calm behavior that Superintendent Moore found so suspicious was simply how Wallace processed trauma, the same man who wept openly in court when his diary entries about Julia were read aloud. Moore had already decided Wallace was guilty. He took that conviction to his grave in 1951, even after the Court of Appeal had ruled otherwise. The police files that might have contained evidence pointing to Perry were destroyed in 1940, handed over to a salvage collector by an official who forgot that murder has no statute of limitations. Wallace suspected Perry from the moment he was released. In September 1931, after their confrontation on the street, Wallace wrote in his diary, "He must realize that I suspect him of the terrible crime." But Wallace was a broken man by then, shunned by neighbors and colleagues, his nerves shattered. Julia and William Herbert Wallace share a common grave in Anfield Cemetery. The grave is difficult to find, surrounded by high grass and weeds, with plain stone inscriptions. The case has been called an impossible mystery, a chess problem with no solution. But the solution was there all along. The police just refused to see it. William Herbert Wallace was innocent. He was convicted, sentenced to death, acquitted on appeal, and then destroyed by the court of public opinion, all for a crime committed by a man the police chose not to investigate.